Hello, welcome everybody. It's fantastic to have you here. So just to check that you're in the right place, this is an introduction to welding with Professor Jayne Osgood. And I really want to stress right from the beginning that this is very much an introduction to welding. So if you have no idea what welding is, if you have no idea how it relates to early childhood, you're in the right place. We're going to be absolutely on the side of the novice in this event, people that are new to welding. Having said that, if you've got a pretty good understanding of welding, if you've been doing it for a while even, then we're excited to have you here too and welcome. And we hope that it's an event that will be a learning experience for all of us and a chance to share and grow together. So even though Jayne is very much playing the starring role tonight, and we're very grateful for that, it really is a team that's been behind this event. So we're all, just to tell you a bit about ourselves, we're all based in the education department at Middlesex, and more specifically with a team behind the MA Childhood and Education in Diverse Societies. I'm going to let Lee Jerome tell you a bit more about the MA in just a second. He'll say just a few words about the MA. But before I do that, I just wanted to tell you kind of a bit about the event and what to expect in terms of the format, because we've only got an hour together and we want to make that hour really work. So after Lee has spoken, we'll introduce Jayne. Jayne will give a brief presentation, so just about 20 minutes long, and it really will be the introduction that was promised. We're then going to try and shake things up a bit with a dialogue between Jayne and then one of our wonderful PhD students here at the Centre of Education Research and Scholarship, that's Sid Mohandis. Now, I know that Sid at the moment has a little bit of a shaky internet connection, so fingers crossed we will have Sid. If not, we've got backup dialogue participants at the ready. We've asked Sid to ask Jayne the questions that everyone is thinking and wondering, but sometimes we feel a bit shy to ask. So he's going to do that and set the tone for the questions and the discussion that we really want to feature in this event. And while Sid and Jayne are in dialogue for about 15 minutes, you'll have the opportunity to share your own questions in the chat. And then we'll have some time to field those questions and put them to Jayne. So we really want this to be a space of openness and bring a spirit of curiosity that is shared genuinely by many of us. So for many of us organising this event, we're new to welding too. And so we've come ready to learn, ready to try and understand together. Just some small housekeeping bits, of course. As you all know, we're also used to these Zoom events now. Please keep your mic on mute so that we don't get any background noise. I apologise now if any of my 3 children come crashing in as I'm trying to transition from one bit to the other. It happens. So don't worry if you do let some background noise in, but we'll just try and keep on mute as much as we can. You're welcome to use the chat throughout. So, do just start by saying good evening and introducing yourself, or if it's not evening, wherever you are, letting us know where you are in the world. And as we go, we'll do our best to post relevant links to information in the chat so that you can follow up on anything that gets mentioned, and you can do a little bit of your own digging to go a bit further. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Lee Jerome, who is Programme Leader of the MA Childhood and Education in Diverse Societies.
Okay, thanks very much, Mona, for organising this evening, and welcome to everyone. I'm just going to speak for maybe a minute to say something about the master's course. A few years ago, we sat down with our students and asked them what kind of a course they would like to do when they finish their undergraduate studies. And they were really clear, as you might expect, on some things they didn't want, some things they felt they'd had quite enough of during their BA course, and gave us a really clear steer on the kinds of things they wanted. So this master's does at least 2 things that they requested. The first is, it's the most personalizable program that I've ever worked on. So every point of assignment, or every point of assessment, is individualized to the student's interest. Every assignment is negotiated between students and tutors, and they kind of pick the content that they want to focus on to meet the learning outcomes of the module. So it's a program where everyone leaves the year or 2 years having achieved a whole range of different but related things. And then the second thing they were really clear about is enough of theory, enough of classrooms. we want to do some stuff in the real world and secure an impact. So there is a rich variety of hands-on community-based experiences that the students have got stuck into in the first few years of the program. But the guiding principle is that when you leave the course, you have some direct experience of working with people in an area of need where you feel you could make a contribution, and then you can leave having reflected on that hands-on experience. And what we're hoping is anyone that comes on the course will leave feeling and being able to demonstrate to others that they are more employable as a consequence, that they have done something to build their capacity to lead or contribute to the leadership of social change, that they have honed their research skills, and more importantly for us perhaps, they've practiced the skills of disseminating so that they can think about how we all use research to secure an impact as professionals. And then of most relevance for tonight maybe is they leave having engaged in critical and creative thinking. And Mona leads our fantastic module, which is about engaging with dangerous thinking and dangerous ideas. And on that module, one of our most perhaps dangerous thinkers is Professor Osgood, who's going to give us a little flavour of how she tries to unsettle us and our students every year. So I'll hand directly over to her.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Is my PowerPoint there? Fabulous. Okay, I'm just so thrilled that so many people are here, and I just want to underscore the point that Mona so eloquently and forcefully made, that this is an introduction. It's very much scratching the surface of worlding. I know that amongst us in the audience today, there are people who are extremely expert at this. So this is to give you a flavour and a sense, and my particular take on it. I mean, I think I've been working with worlding or versions of worlding for about a decade. So the idea that I can squeeze it all into 20 minutes feels like an impossible task, but I'll do my very best. So what I want to do is to offer you an overview, a very sort of generalist overview, and some insights from my encounters with and experiences of worlding in early childhood research. Could I have the next slide, please? So worlding, what on earth is it? I think the first thing I really want to impress upon you all is that it's not one thing. It can't be one thing, and there is never only one way to do it. It's about diverse range of approaches, and many researchers are taking up worlding in their studies, and what it looks like depends upon context, histories and geographies. It's the situatedness in relation to the world that is significant. So my worlding will never be the same as Mona's worlding or somebody in another geopolitical context or another country, because we all have a different engagement with the world. But reassuringly, there are some principles and characteristics that mark research as concerned with worlding. And those characteristics are that it is an immersive, embodied, affective, and sensory approach to investigating the world and children's connected place to their world and everything that's in the world. So it's very much an embodied practice. It's about relationships, and not just human to human relationships, relationships to environment, to spaces, places, matter, things, atmospheres, feelings, sensations, and how that connects to the wider world in an environmental, political, and ultimately worldly sense. It's about recognizing that humans are connected to the world around them in endless ways. It is also recognizing that humans are not the most superior species on planet Earth. We only have to look at the situation we're in right now. COVID-19, an invisible global pandemic virus, has us all locked in our rooms and communicating via Zoom. So there are some forces, planetary forces, worldly forces that are bigger than us. And we're entangled with them, and we have to take them seriously. And it's not just a virus, but we can think about hurricanes, we can think about forest fires, or we could think about the humble bee. Now, the bee we rely upon for our survival, yet we consider ourselves far superior to it. Without the bee, biodiversity and our survival is under threat. So yeah, that's the essence of worlding is reappraising who and what we are as a species. So it's about how we're connected to the world and the difference the world around us makes to our experiences, and in turn, how we can make worlds differently in ethical ways. Now, worldling is also a philosophy. Now, some fairly daunting terms that are often associated with worlding are posthumanism and feminist new materialism. Now, I don't want to get bogged down with those. Should you join the MA, then you would be immersed in those philosophical ideas and theoretical frameworks. But really, it's, as I've mentioned here, it's about monism. And monism is oneness. And this goes back to the point about our entangled place. So oneness is the underpinning philosophy. We are relationally connected, dependent, and entangled. So the concern becomes with what we do and how we do it in ways that foreground a worldling sensibility. This capacity to recognize our connectedness, enmeshment, entangled state means that we can experience the world in new and exciting ways with fresh optics. We can then tell lively stories about how we are in the world and how else our relationship with and to the world might take shape. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so my go-to theorist or philosopher, and there are many, but Haraway is, I just find inspirational. But as I say, there are many, many others that have a lot to say about worlding. But this quote from Haraway I find particularly helpful because it emphasizes worlding as a verb, as a doing, as a practice. And it's about knowledge making, world making. It's about storytelling and narratives. And it's about connections to other creatures and species. And in that second section there, I think the thing that is really important is the connection, the very strong link, the tight coupling, as she terms it, between writing and research. So it becomes a game of playing a game of cat's cradle, both metaphorically and materially. So it's pulling at strings and seeing what stories unfold and what knots you encounter along the way. It is playfully serious and emphasizes our embeddedness to that which we research. We are never separate from that which we research. We are always entangled, enmeshed, affected, and affecting. But Haraway stresses that it's very much a hopeful science, and that's where I feel quite encouraged, because world making means we can actively make a difference. And this is the point that Lee was raising about the courses that we run at Middlesex, is about making a difference in the world. And that difference comes about from establishing a better understanding of the worlds that we live in and our responsibilities within each moment to that world and our place within the world. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So why do we need worlding? Is it just another way of approaching research? Is it just a new trend? And that's a regular criticism that's waged against posthumanist approaches to early childhood research. But I would fervently argue no. Well, I would, wouldn't I? But worlding has a very long established existence in other cultures and throughout histories. We have to take serious indigenous approaches and the insights that they offer about relationships to the world. And they offer us a very clear guide, but it's absolutely imperative that we neither appropriate nor colonize, but recognize that this worlding or this approach to being in the world and thinking about ourselves as an entangled is not new. It's been around for millennia, for a very, very long time. But the need to approach childhood research in early childhood in other ways is pressing because of what is happening to the world. We are living in a time now known as the Anthropocene. Essentially, man's destruction of planet Earth has reached a tipping point. The demands for progress, more and better, the striving for some mythical point of actualization has got us into a terrible mess. We only have to look at Greta Thunberg's important activism to know that this is widely recognized by some of the youngest. Children get this. So childhood and early childhood education rests upon this developmentalist logic about ages and stages and progress and mastery and moving on to the next step. And that is what our research and teaching has become principally preoccupied with. And what I'm suggesting is that Welding offers us other ways to be and become with children that sees them as embedded, engaged in world making through exploration, processes, and open-ended inquiry. Not about the acquisition or demonstration of a narrow set of skills that we can measure. And there is so much more that we are missing when that is our frame of reference. So Welding in childhood context becomes much more speculative, much more open-ended, exploratory, and being open to what else might be going on, what else is there, if only we allow ourselves to look with a different optics. And it's by taking up what-if practices, so being much more open and much more speculative and much more receptive to the not known and the not yet known. Okay, the next slide, please. So how might you do Welding? What might this involve? Now, as I've said, Welding is a philosophy, a practice, an attitude, a disposition, a way of life, and a means to make a difference in the world by taking matter, space, place, and their relationships to the heart of our inquiries. Now, this photo in the background to this slide is my daughter some years ago now. She was about 2.5, 3, and you can see her abandoned supper, her favourite supper, abandoned. And this was her responding, being hailed to something else other than her supper. Her attention was arrested. So she had the sequins on her t-shirt, the sun was casting through the window, and there you have refraction, diffraction, reflection, sparkling and dancing on the wall, and that had us all mesmerized, and her supper went cold. So it's about taking up a childlike way of being in the world, of noticing and attuning and being sensitive, and allowing yourself, giving yourself the permission to wander and to wonder and to be struck by the wonder of things. So think here with an Alice in Wonderland sensibility, the curiousness of life. Let yourself fall down the rabbit hole. Exercise the arts of noticing in the everyday, the mundane, the humdrum of what unfolds in early childhood contexts. Allow yourself to be affected, to sit with discomfort, to slow down, to notice and enjoy the joy of the everyday. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so there are many researchers working with Welding in different geopolitical contexts and seeking to deeply immerse themselves and their child participants in world-making practices. And it's through delving into uncomfortable national, colonial histories and confronting environmental and ecological challenges such as pollution, deforestation, social inequalities, class inequalities. Children are part of this and they're interested and they're curious. So Welding is an opportunity to build on that curiosity and in fact reawaken your own. So this book, Feminist Research for 21st Century Childhoods, Commonwealth Method, edited by Denise Hodgins, is one that I've been involved in. I'm one of the series editors, along with Veronica Pacini-Ketchabel of this series at Bloomsbury. And this volume brings together 19 chapters that provide really lively, wide-ranging examples of what welding looks like, how it's shaped by and enacts theory. So this takes us back to Haraway's point about the coupling of writing and research as inseparable. The theory is there, but you have these very lively accounts of what welding is. So the authors stroke researchers in this book take the everyday to be found in early childhood contexts, such as clay, fabric, sticks, gatherings, playing, caring, co-laboring, all of which regularly and habitually shape early childhood education. And through their worlding practices, offer up insights and ways to think about and do childhood differently in ways that are ethical and responsible and worldly. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So over the past 10 years, I've taken up my version of worlding, which looks very different to those 19 chapters of. There are some similarities, but there are also some significant differences. And this takes us back to the very beginning when I said that worlding is a very situated endeavor. But over the past decade, I've taken up worlding as a practice in research, and it's become not just a way of researching, but a way of life. And that sounds a little bit evangelical, but it kind of seeps into your being, and it's hard to live in any other key. So it's become a way of being in the world, a way of parenting, a way of collaborating, and a way of taking seriously my interconnections and capacities to be affected and to affect change. So it's by taking matter seriously. So here there are publications of mine that have dealt with each of these, but not as individual material objects, but rather as entangled relational events, if you like. So I've written about the ballet tutu, I've written about Chinese New Year, I've written about glitter and plastic animal figurines, the Lego brick, and most recently lichen has caught my attention and taken me on all sorts of adventures of sensing and being troubled, being curious and finding out, wanting to find out more, tracing the connections and unearthing often dystopian facts from science, from other disciplines. So it becomes a very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary project. And then it's about bringing it all together in lively storytelling. And that's the fun bit, actually, that you can push against the conventions of how you write research and what counts as valid knowledge. And that's really exciting. So worlding, I would suggest, is a never-ending practice, but taking it up in our research adds a depth, another depth, a richness that holds transformative potential. Worlding is a form of activism. It's about the change in the world that Lee spoke about at the beginning. So through cultivating a deep appreciation and attunement to the world as it emerges through our everyday relations, means that we can identify ways to make other choices, ethical choices, deeply considered choices about how to be and become with children. Okay, that's me done.
Thank you, Jane. Your timing is impeccable. Absolutely impeccable. Well done. Thank you. Sid, how are you doing for your internet? Are you able to start off the dialogue?
It seems okay. Can you hear me?
We can indeed. Fantastic, Sid. Thank you so much. So, Sid, you're gonna ask your questions of Jane. While you do that,
well, thanks, Jane, for that.
I would just invite. Sorry,
thanks, Jane, for that excellent presentation.
Just to interrupt you for a second, Sid, because I just want to say that please do pop your questions into the chat as Sid and Jane have this conversation, because we'll then have a chance to field those questions after Sid and Jane's dialogue. So use this opportunity to get your voice, your comments, your questions into the chat. Apologies, Sid, I am now finished and it's over to you. Oh no, Sid, I've made you freeze. Okay, Sid, I'm going to get us started with the dialogue, and then hopefully when you come back in with your good internet, you'll be able to chip in and pick up where I leave off. Jane, you mentioned in one of the slides where you were talking about the features of worlding, you mentioned this kind of deep hanging out. And that's a phrase that many of us will be familiar with in relation to ethnography. So this work of sensing and coming to understand on a deep level, how is worlding different from ethnography? Is it different from ethnography, and what makes it so?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a question I've had presented to me many times, and I think that there are certainly some similarities. There are some crossovers, and I think it's fair to say that maybe worlding and these sorts of affective approaches and that involve observation and hanging out with participants share something with ethnography, but they also depart, worlding and post-humanist approaches depart quite significantly. And I think it's largely to do with the underpinning philosophy. And also ethnography, by definition, is about a scientific description of people and culture and taking account of customs, habits and difference. It's very human-centric, anthropocentric. So what post-humanist approaches or worlding does is to bring all that other stuff into the frame, and rather have it as a backdrop or a context, it becomes as significant and it has as much to tell us as the human subjects themselves. But of course, the other criticism that's often waged against post-humanist approach and worlding is that it erases the human, that the human subject becomes so insignificant and so decentered that actually we no longer bring the human into our frame of reference. And I would dispute that too. What it's about is a flattened ontology. It's about bringing all of the actors, the human, the non-human, the more than human, and their relationalities and what gets produced through them coming together. That becomes the focus of your inquiry, not the human as your starting place. So yes, there are similarities, there are overlaps, but there are also significant differences, and it hinges upon the philosophy of posthumanism and feminist new materialism that positions the human in a different way. So ethnography and the method becomes something different.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sidi?
I hope this works.
We're on question 2 now, Sid.
All right. Okay. So the second question was really, when I first started engaging with post-human theories, I was working as a preschool nursery teacher, and I remember being deeply interested in the philosophy, but found the denseness of the literature quite impenetrable and anxiety-inducing. So as a practitioner on low pay, overburdened with all the processes of doing early childhood education, as well as grappling with my own personal issues, I remember not having the energy or the time or the resources to understand the complexities of post-human theories. So my question really is, how can this world of richness and complexity be made more accessible to practitioners?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. I know it's because I'm a real theory geek. I love theory. I could happily sit and just wallow in philosophy and theory for days, all by myself. But that's just me. But I do recognise, and particularly in the context of the masters, that philosophy and theory has to be useful. And Hilary Lenz Taguchi, amongst many others, have written about the theory practice divide. And I think what's really hopeful about posthumanism and worlding is that it bridges that, it pulls them together. So the theory is important. You can't do this work without engaging in the theory, but the theory is real. It's about our entanglement in the world, and worlding in particular as a practice and a concept, I think is really helpful to see how it might be more accessible. And the book that I mentioned, Feminist Research for 21st Century Childhoods, provides, as I say, 19 examples of researcher educators putting this to work in their everyday practice. And I think early childhood is, unlike some other educational context, lends itself to this sensory, affective, bodily, haptic, kind of unpredictability, because very small children are all of those things. So all that it really requires is for you to tune into that way of being, that lively unpredictability, and noticing if you've ever sort of spotted a child become completely fixated. And my daughter used to be obsessed with lavender because it was a smelly bush. You should stand there for hours, sniffing and pulling and poking, and it's that kind of sensory engagement with the world. And then what the worlding does from a kind of theoretical or academic or social change position is to take a deeper look at lavender. Where does lavender come from? What does it do? What's our relationship to lavender? What's the history of lavender? What's the etymology of lavender? And really just get completely immersed in that event, that entanglement, and what it can tell us about the world and our place in the world. So I would say, yes, the theory is difficult, but I think that's true of any theoretical orientation. Any theory that informs research should be complex, but I think there are ways in. And what I would really strongly urge against is oversimplifying it, because it needs to be complex. The world is complex, and we need complex explanations, complex theories to enable us to engage with the world in all its complexities and to feel it and sense it. So I think, yes, I totally take on board what you're saying, Sid, that this can feel like too much, but I think there are ways in, and there are, and I think as it's a growing field of inquiry, there are more and more examples coming on board the whole time of people working with this in their practice and the difference it can make. So
Great, thanks, Jane. My next question is kind of related. It is in relation to practicality. And one of the frequent questions I get asked is, how is this practical? I mean, particularly within the context of how early and primary years are constrained by curriculum goals and assessment demands and inspection frameworks. What can practitioners do with this kind of research in terms of, especially when it is inconclusive and non-prescriptive in nature? What can you actually do with it?
Okay. So you've gone off script, which is fine. I've got a question I wasn't expecting, but that's absolutely fine. So I think that there's much that practitioners can do, and I think what this sort of approach can do is activate a form of subversion and resistance. We might feel beholden and pressured by assessment goals, accountability frameworks, inspection regimes, and this might all feel a little bit loose and unpin downable. That to my mind is its joy, but I also recognize that practitioners need to have some sort of demonstrable account of the difference that this makes. And there are some really beautiful examples, actually. One I came across is a children's centre in Bristol called the Red House, and they were required, as all children's centres are, to update their strategic plan for the next however many years. And they just couldn't bear to do it. They had been reading critical writings about the problematics of neoliberalism and all these, the burden of bureaucracy and so on. I said, is there a way that we can do this differently? Can we approach a strategic plan, and can we play with it? And they unwittingly engaged in this really beautiful posthumanist project of worlding, where they wrote the strategic plan as a story, as a fictional account of a small child who'd come to the children's centre, and they described in detail her sensory, affected, embodied experiences of walking through the door, smelling what was cooking, touching the objects, spending time in the garden, and all of this. And as it unfolded, it told the inspectors everything they needed to know about quality and measures of quality, but it became Violet's story, and they were awarded an outstanding grade. That takes some bravery and some courage. I'm not suggesting everybody should write a Violet story, but I'm saying there are examples where practitioners can use this welding practice in a strategic and quite activist way to push back against things that feel really constraining and suffocating. And there are other examples, really lively examples. So in Australia, there are the ELF, which is the Early Years Learning Framework pirates, and they're sort of group of they do exist, but they live by avatars. They are these female pirates, and they have completely found a space, a virtual and otherworldly space, to critique the learning framework, to critique inspection, and to push against it and provide their stories. So it is this storytelling again in a virtual space online, when they have, they're really popular amongst practitioners. Like, if you bring critique and creativity together and you're playfully serious, what else might be possible? So I think there are some really, really exciting examples. And I also think, and I think I've said this already, is that early childhood lends itself to this. If we tune into, if we take on that childlike sensibility and we can bring that into policy, practice, pedagogy, we can learn with and from children, as opposed to adhering to these very strict kind of structured oppressive regimes that sit around us, that tell us that only certain sorts of knowledge and measurability and accountability is valid. But there are other ways to do things. And I think, embracing the productive, generative possibilities of welding in all aspects and layers of early childhood practice is just there for the taking. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but I do feel there is an unfair criticism against posthumanism, that it doesn't have any practical application and it can't make any difference in terms of policy and practice and strategy and quality. And it absolutely can, and it absolutely does. But it's in the small, it's in the detail, it's in the complexity and the detail.
Thanks, Jane. My final question is there, I know you already mentioned Denise Hodgen's book, but is there any other book that you would recommend for someone who's beginning to grapple with welding?
I've mentioned it twice. I do think it's an amazing book. So Hodgen's edited collection. I've also, without sounding like I'm sort of, kind of promoting my own book, but I am, is in the same series. In fact, the whole series is fabulous, but Feminist Researching Gender Childhoods. This is where you'll find some of the chapters that I mentioned previously, the Lego chapter. There's a beautiful chapter by Kerry Robinson and Jen Littleton Smith, where they take dressing up as a verb, as a doing, as a welding, and what that does. It's a routine part of everyday practice in early childhood, but what stories does that tell us, or different stories can it tell us about early childhood and gender? So, but the other really great, there are just increasing numbers of resources, and I wouldn't call them resources because they're just beautiful stories that really make you think differently and make you, push you to think really seriously but playfully about this stuff. Is a fabulous collection by Childhood Nature series, which is the series editors are Karen Malone, Marek Taser and Sonia Arndt, and that is just growing and growing. There's such a scholarship building in this whole area, and there are lots of edited collections, but they're really wide ranging. And this goes back to the point I made at the beginning about how no two worldings, my two worldings will never look the same. But then you look at the diversity and the ways in which different people are approaching this in different spaces and places, and the usefulness of theory and how we can think differently about early childhood whilst tapping into this urgent need to address what's going on in the Anthropocene. So yeah, but there are also a whole ton of journal special issues that take up posthumanist theorizing, posthumanist practice, feminist new materialism. I'm engaged in guest editing a special issue of contemporary issues in early childhood with Karen Mouris, who's another big name in this area. And we're looking at the very point I was raising previously about the threat of erasing the human child from our inquiries when you bring all this other stuff into your frame of reference. So yeah, there's kind of endless resources out there, and some really, really amazing and exciting stuff, and lots of the most innovative and engaging stuff is from early career researchers and PhD students. And I have the pleasure of examining many theses and seeing these pieces of work before they make it out into the world. So yeah, there's an incredible body of scholarship. Yes, Blaze, absolutely. Thank you, Mindy Blaze. It's almost too many. The Commonwealth's Collective, which are captured. Mindy Blaze is actually in Hodgins' book. That's why I recommend that. It's 19 chapters, but there's probably like 30 authors because lots of co-authored bits. So there's just an incredible kind of growing community of scholars working with these ideas.
Thank you, Jane. I'll pass it on to Mona.
Thank you so much, Sid, and thank you, Jane. Amazing dialogue there. And we did have a few questions in the chat, and our friend Nathan, I think, is going to be able to field those. But just to say, we do have space for a few more. We've got just less than 15 minutes for questions to be posed to Jane. So do keep them coming, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Nathan, can I hand over to you and you kind of field stuff from the chat?
Yeah, that's fine. Hello, everyone. There's a few questions that have come in. I think the first one to pop in was from Maddie. Maddie, do you want to ask Jane herself, or would you prefer me to?
Oh, hi. I didn't know that was an option. Hello. It's put my video on as well. Hi. So yeah, I'm in the process of writing a PhD proposal, which is all to do with joining children in play as an adult, and using the approaches of improvisation, drawing from sort of the art of clowning. And I'm hoping to sort of do some deep hanging out. I think hadn't heard of that term before, but it's about time I did, I think, because it sounds really relevant in various contexts with different people who do improvise with children. And I was wondering if you had any connections to share that were to do with the art of improvisation and how that links in with welding. It does sound like there's a huge amount of crossover in especially one of the slides, which I wrote millions of notes from. I don't know if anything struck you, but anyway, thank you very much for the amazing seminar today.
Oh, well, thanks for the question, and thanks for being here. I think improvisation is really, really fascinating because it is partly responding to and attuning to, but there's also a level of choreography, if I'm that comes with it. So there's some adult choreography and organization, but there's also them being responsive to the child. So I think that that's one of the things that I've really grappled with, and where I've been taken to task by practitioners when I've been in a room deep hanging out and trying not to be too involved or directing what's going on so much as just being there and absorbing. It's actually really hard. It's almost inscribed on your body to go and intervene and do things. And so I suppose that's my one point of which I think is quite a challenge, is to how do you re-evaluate or reassess who you are as an adult, coming in with this kind of knowledge and expertise from that particular, performing arts perspective into a space with children, and also with a kind of particular view of what pedagogy is, your relationship to the children, your relationship to space, as putting it all to pedagogical use. But worlding would suggest that you perhaps take a step back, and it is that slowing down and taking a distance and trying to absorb what's going on. And that absorption comes over time. When you're in the deep hanging out moment, it can feel completely overwhelming because there's so much going on. And what do you pay attention to? And if it's about some pedagogical doing, then you're deeply immersed and engaged in that too. So the attuning takes a conscious effort to step back, to kind of not remove yourself. It's almost a deeper immersion, but you need to kind of be open to the surprises that are unfolding, and those surprises become something else if you're intervening and choreographing the whole time. So and it's a very odd thing for people you're there with to get their head around what you're doing. So I was some research I did with babies around Chinese New Year, and I was just sitting on the floor for hours playing with noodles. And the practitioners are like, so sorry, did you say you had a degree in developmental psychology? Are you a childhood expert? What are you doing here? Because I'm just kind of sitting there getting down with the noodles and the snot and whatever else, and then coming back to it later. And it just looks, when I say put aside a sense of yourself as expert, you really do look like the ultimate novice, just like not really doing very much at all, but just absorbing it all. So it's but of course, some of the chapters in this book are much more directive. There's much more choreography and intentionality. And that's where, as I say, worlding takes very different shapes and unfolds in different ways. And that's where the kind of the pre-reading and the deep immersion in the theory gets you to a point of, okay, so affect, you need to, read around affect and attunement and noticing and all of this. There's books on each of these little bullet points that I've given you. But so it's kind of being kind of bold enough to let go of your sense of expertise and being open to what's there.
The next two questions were actually from Mona and myself, so I suggest we skip those, given that we're colleagues, and go to the couple of people that have come in involved. I think the next one down my list was Ted. Ted had a question to us. Do you want me to read it out, or are you happy to do it yourself?
He's in the library.
Okay, I'll read it. Let me just scroll back. Ted's asked, just as a manner of clarification, I was confused whether you argue for or against the notion of flat ontologies, and if you could clarify in any case.
Okay, I'm arguing for flattened ontologies, and what I'm arguing against is the idea that the human is erased. So the flattened ontology places the human with equal significance to all the other non-human, more than human actors within that particular event or situation. But what I'm arguing against is the idea that the human no longer exists, that the human is no longer of interest to us in our research. It's more about the relationships, the relationalities, and what gets produced in those moments from all of these things entangling and generating affect. So yeah, it's for flattened ontologies, but against the idea of the erasure of the human.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Got another question. I've just seemed to have lost it, from Caris. Would you like me to introduce it, or again, if you're there, Caris?
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Thank you. Hi, Jane. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and for adding to my wish list on Amazon. I'm really interested to know away from your professional life as a researcher, how has worlding impacted on your everyday being?
Oh gosh, it's been completely transformative. I can't, the way in which I live my life is really exhausting. The the ethical responsibilities in every moment of every day are just kind of all consuming. So I can't pick anything up or consume anything or go anywhere or do anything without all of this kind of racing around in my head, and then this desperate need to find out more and find out more. I guess I was probably like that anyway, but once you encounter posthumanist and feminist new materialist philosophy, it becomes all consuming. And the example I often give is my two children. I have one who's just about to come up to 14 and the other is 10. And when I had my first child, I knew a bit about early childhood, but I was approaching it from probably sort of theoretically critique, discourse analysis. That's where I was at, regimes of Foucault and Butler and all of that kind of stuff. So that really influenced, I think, how I was as a parent. By the time I got to my second child, I'd read Deleuze, I was deeply into Haraway, and my experiences of being a mother to her were just so different because I saw things differently, I felt things differently, I encountered them differently. And just as that, in conversation with Maddie a moment ago, I was able to step back, I was able to let things unfold and learn with and from her, which sounds ridiculous. Well, it doesn't sound ridiculous to early childhood experts because we're all amazed by children, but just kind of when you step back and you wonder out their wonder, and just how enriching that is, and how the theory then comes together with the parenting practice, which comes together with everyday life, it's just it was such a different experience and such a kind of enriching, and the theory made much more sense. And I can see Omretta Otterstad smiling because she came to this and now has these grandchildren. And so her experiences of being a grandmother, very different from being a mother, because of the way that theory and practice are totally enmeshed and entangled and shapes your being in the world. But I think for me, I think I've probably always thought of myself as an activist, but now I see posthumanism and worlding as a form of activism that happens in the big spaces. It's about the Anthropocene, it's about COVID-19, it's about all of that, but it's in the small stuff too, and it's being able, how those connect on a moment by moment daily. The encounters we have in every moment of every day is just it's kind of mind-boggling. I sleep well at night. I'm exhausted.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Now we seem to have a rush of questions just to finish on it. I think we've only got 2 minutes, so I'm not sure what to do about this. Sarah's asked a question about whether there are any great podcasts on welding, which maybe if anybody knows of any, they can post. Liz has got a question that certainly is not going to be answered in 2 minutes' time, I don't think. People use posthumanism and feminist new materialism interchangeably. Very confusing. Can you explain? And there was another one about how you might respond to critiques of posthumanism and new materialism as giving attention to materials when humans are oppressed and overly policed. Black Lives Matter and so on. Mm-hmm. But you've got a minute, so
yeah, I've got a minute. Okay. Right, okay, so firstly, the feminist new materialism, posthumanism, I would describe myself as a feminist new materialist, but I have a problem with the new. As I said before, these ideas are not new. But I'm a feminist, and what I do is political. And that's not to say that posthumanists aren't political, but it can fall into the space of being apolitical or quite indulgent around the theory and the philosophy. But what difference does this make in the world? So I think for me, the feminist new materialism connects to that second question, is that it's a political project about making a difference in the world. And the paper that I gave last week before, the lichen paper, I think really massively underlines the fact that this is about those, it is about social inequality, it is about social class and race and gender, and the problematics that actually environmental injustice, the effects of the Anthropocene affect some of us, i.e. those already marginalised groups, in ways more acutely and more to greater devastation than the affluent, the privileged. So I don't see them as separate things. I think you have to join up the dots. You have to ensure that your work is political and that you bring those things into your frame of inquiry. So no, and it goes back to my point about flattened ontologies versus removing the human. And I do not want to remove the human. I'm a sociologist by trade. That's my background, you know. So, and that's really fundamentally important. But I think the point that Lee raised at the beginning about social change, I think what we're talking about is worldly change or worldly justice. So it's more than the social and the human. It's environmental. It's political. It's all of those things. How am I doing? Is that 2 minutes? I must have gone over.
I think Mona's about to step in now and stand for authority on matters.
That was wonderful. Thank you. We packed in a lot, and as Nathan, just echoing what Nathan put in the chat, apologies if we couldn't get to you, but we did have some really rich dialogue there. Fantastic. Lynette, I'm going to hand over to you to offer our closing remarks for the event.
Thank you very much, Mona. So thanks so much to you, Jane, for sharing your understanding. Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone's going to agree with that. And thanks to all of the organisers, but particularly Sid for leading the dialogue, and Nathan for the difficult task of getting all those contributions together. Well done. And thanks to everyone who's been here and been part of the event. We really hope you're taking away new ideas and thoughts. We'll be posting a video of the event online, and we'll be doing more events like this in the future. The easiest way to stay connected with us and see what we're doing is through our Twitter account. And Mona, I think you're putting that in the chat as I speak. And directly through the SIRS website, which is another one there that we can put in the chat. As Mona and Lee mentioned at the beginning, this event is a taster event for the MA Childhood and Education in Diverse Societies here at Middlesex University. So if you're thinking about an MA, please do have a look at the programme. Can we have a link there as well to our web pages in the chat, please, Mona? And of course, you can reach out to Lee and Mona to find out more about the programme and just chat it through and just see if, you know, what we offer aligns with your ideas and your ambitions and aspirations. We're all very friendly. We're all really happy to have a chat. So, you know, connect with us. It will be great. So thank you, everybody, and have a lovely evening.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.